A wee while back, Phil from Phil's Mini decided to host a little competition for the fine folks in a Discord server we're all a part of. So naturally, I jumped at the opportunity to see what I can do. The rules were quite simple, a 100mm base with a single main miniature, but we're allowed to use some smaller ones to decorate the base, and we must put in as much effort into the base as we do in the Mini. Simple, eh? So I took the opportunity to build a diorama I've wanted to do for quite a while. I had the idea of doing a lone knight standing off against a single rat man coming from a sewer, but he was not yet aware of the horde lurking just below the surface. Not sure if it still falls within the parameters of the competition, but that doesn't really matter. I was invested and was having way too much fun to change my mind. I've never built a diorama before, so I wasn't entirely sure what I was doing, but I've got enough overconfidence in my abilities that I'd just steam on doing what felt right. Chopping up chunks of foam and gluing them to the MDF would work quite well as a base and a top, and an old Pringles tube served its purpose to get a nice sewery kind of shape. Admittedly, I should have left a little more on the side for walkways, but things don't always go according to plan when you don't make one. I've seen a few folks using air drying clay quite well for making roads and such like, so I rolled some nice and thin and used a green stuff world roller to get an easy brick pattern before gluing them very carefully onto the sewers. I wasn't overly worried about the clay cracking because I figured that would add to the effect of it being old and dirty. Same happened for the street above, only using a cobblestone roller instead of a brick. It's nice to have a bit of variation and show the difference between the two surfaces. Plus I bought these rollers, so need to use them for something, right? Since it takes a long time for the clay to dry, I had a dig through my super secret homemade box of forgotten things that I never thought I would find a use for. Conveniently, this is where I keep all my extra scavenge that don't fit into my Warcry warbands. I had a nice variety of plague monks and clan rats, so I picked about 14 or 15 that gave me a nice mixture, so it didn't look too stale. I wanted to paint them quite simple, but still quite effective. So I went with a mixture of colours on the skin, or fur. Rats do come in all sorts of colours, so we've got some white, some dark brown, some light brown, some greyish tones, varieties, the spice of life and all that, eh? The robes and cloth kind of bits got a mixture of browns and purples. The purple only really on the plague monks to make them stand out a bit more, and the metallics got a mixture of gunmetal or silver. Again, just to keep a little bit of variance between everything, and then finally the wood got a dark brown coat. I'm feeling myself getting a little too into using oil washes these days, so naturally I went with my default setting and covered all the rat boys in a coat and used the makeup brushes to get some cheap and easy highlights. I've got a very basic stone recipe that I'd like to think is pretty effective and gives some interesting colours. All it is a base coat of grey stippled over with a dark bone colour, then stippled with a lighter grey and finishing up with a lighter bone colour. Doesn't really need to have a wash put over it, as long as you can keep out the recesses with the stippling. The sewer sections needed to look a bit more grotty and disgusting, for obvious reasons. So to get that lived-in look, I took a base coat of brown, and then used my favourite stippling technique with a pretty dark green, followed by a much lighter green. Wee brown oil wash doesn't go amiss either, but they look pretty toxic without it. I completely forgot back at the beginning that the sewers would probably need some sidewalls to hold things up and that. These are the things that happen when you don't actually have a plan, or a clue what you're doing. So I chopped up some little sections of foam core, cut off the paper front so it would make things a bit easier to use my brick roller and continue the texture. And then I painted them up in the same way as the sewers, with the browns and greens and an oil wash on top. This bit really should have been done before I started to paint everything, but I forgot that I wanted a pipe to go from the street down to the sewers. So I had to risk buggering it all up by drilling a big muckle hole right through the top. Thankfully it went well, so I crammed up some rolled up toilet paper in there and super glued it together. I figured now would be as good a time as any to glue in the rat boys in a big stack to look like they're climbing over the top each other, and got ready for my first ever resin pour. Spoiler alert, I fucked it up. I mixed up some UV resin with some green ink and got to pouring a layer in the bottom of the sewer pipe to look like disgusting pissy water. What I didn't realise is that I put up some barriers at either end of the pipe, but got distracted and went to do something else, and then completely forgot to actually seal the barriers properly.
Fucking whoops.
Apparently a few dabs of hot glue and tape aren't enough to stop resin leaking out. Who would have known that resin would eat through polystyrene like me eating through a pie? It was an absolute mess. So I had to spend a few extra days slowly filling the dissolved foam with wall filler to stop the whole thing falling to pieces. Absolute nightmare. But lesson learned. pay attention to what you're doing, especially when it comes to resin. Since it was going to take an age for the filler to dry properly, I just carried on with everything else. I'm quite optimistic that way. So I painted up the pipe with some gunmetal silver and then forgot to film the rusting process. The street area looked a wee bit on the dull side, so I mixed up a batch of flocking with PVA to get a difficult to work with paste and started to dab some clumps all over the street. But then I put some big clumps in the sewer because that's where gunk loves to live. The gap filler set up quite nicely after a few days, so I made an attempt at trying to glue everything together with some foam core side support. It's quite nerve wracking to start sticking everything together and hoping that it actually works, or at least it is for me anyway. For some reason, before I even bothered fixing the messy resin pour, I thought it would be a good idea to give the water a turbulent effect with some Vallejo water goo. It looked decent, but it was a bit pointless to do it before I actually fixed anything, which funnily enough was the next thing to get done. I really need to work on my work stream. You wouldn't believe I'm an engineer, would you? This time I used some blue tack to seal my pour and made sure it was really sealed, and then took my time to use a pipette to slowly add small, thin layers of the UV resin into the big holes that were left after the last pour. It took quite a while, but eventually everything filled up nicely and it didn't melt all my hard work. That's a victory in my book. I had a very specific vision in my head for the hero of this piece. I saw a knight, the champion of the city, ignoring the fact that we're using a Stormcast model. He's fought his way to the top and it shows in his armour. So he's got a dark gunmetal silver polished to high sheen and without any blemishes. He's far too hard to take a hit. His armour's trimmed and adorned with gold, a good sign of status, and only a wealthy and successful champion would be allowed such fancy armour in this city. The panels of his armour and shield are filled in with a fancy metallic blue to show the colours of his house. And then to carry on the show of wealth and status, he's got a bright red cape and leather crotch cover. I don't know what it's called. If you do, let me know. It's an expensive colour in those days that's also trimmed with gold. The final display of his power and his status is a fine Damascus blade, which was painted with a metallic black and then really thin silver lines, as thin as I could possibly get, which to be fair isn't that thin. I took a big risk and used an oil wash over the entire model instead of just pin washing it, but I was in a little bit of a hurry to get it finished and it hasn't failed me yet, so I carried on. I took the large majority of the wash away with a makeup sponge, leaving the surfaces slightly tinted but not too much, quite a good amount still left in the recesses. With him good and dry, he was glued into position for what he thinks is a single face-off against a puny little foe. I covered the sections that would be dirt with a texture paste to give the effect that this is a section cut straight through the street, and before the paste dried I stuck in some skulls and the odd weapon or two. I was aiming for that effect in old cartoons when the camera pans through the ground and it's filled with all sorts of crap. I started going in a weird order again by painting the ground brown, and while that dried I went on with painting the edges and the outsides of the diorama in a nice lamp black, or at least the first of 4 or 5 coats anyway. I gave all the skulls around the model a coat of bone colour. This includes a bunch of skulls that are dotted around the piece inside the sewer pipe and then around the top of the pipe at the top, with a little bit of stubbling around the mud and a few different shades of brown, varying the amount of coverage with each layer, and also not bothering if a wee bit got on the skulls and stuff. It was done and ready for entering. This one was a challenge for me, having never built a diorama before, and it was a major pain in the arse. A lot of mistakes were made, but I like to think that I managed to work around them and fix all the things that I fucked up. I'm happy with it, so let's just hope Phil is and he picks mine as a winner. There's quite a lot of tough competition in this one though. If you want to see the other entries, check out the links in the description below, and I'll also make a playlist for anybody that wants to just jump straight in and watch the rest. And I'll catch you in the next one, guys.